So in chapter 10, Paul is defending his ministry. There were some who had come to Corinth from Jerusalem and had criticized Paul and Timothy. These were the Judaizers. And Paul and Timothy's apostolic authority was actually being denied by these Judaizers. And I mentioned this last week, that if the apostle Paul was being criticized, and Timothy, who Paul calls faithful, if he's being criticized, you can expect to be criticized as well. You can't escape it. So some of the members at Corinth had been listening to these criticisms and had come to believe them. So Paul is addressing this problem in chapter 10. In verses 3 through 5, he refers to the divine weapons of warfare that were given to him, he says, for tearing down strongholds, destroying arguments. We looked at that passage last week. And these weapons are primarily, the weapons of warfare, spiritual weapons of warfare, are primarily to be used against unbelieving thought. But notice in verse 6, which we didn't get to last week, so I'm just going to briefly look at it. He says, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. So although these weapons of warfare are mainly for unbelievers, when false notions creep into the church, the weapons of warfare even need to be used in the church. Now we get to verse 7, and I'm going to read this out of the New English translation. Barb, I think that's the one you have. It's very good in this translation. Verse 7 reads this way, you are looking at outward appearances. If anyone is confident that he belongs to Christ, he should reflect on this again, just as he himself belongs to Christ, so too do we. So like the ESV, which is usually a very good translation, I think gets it wrong here. The ESV has something along the lines of look at what you're looking at, or pay attention, or something like that. But really, this is really in the NET done well. He's saying is all you're looking at, Corinthians, those of you who have been influenced by these Judaizers, you're looking at outward appearances. So remember, some of them have departed from being loyal to Paul and were carrying their loyalty over to these Judaizers. They had listened to these opposers and they were influenced by the way they looked. Their appearance had something to do with them being captured by the Judaizers. So these men from Jerusalem kept the trappings of Judaism, which probably impressed some of the Corinthians, especially the people who have Jewish heritage. Well, Jesus had something to say about that not too long before Paul wrote this letter, just 20 years or so earlier. Matthew 23, 2 through 5. Matthew 23, 2 through 5. Jesus says this, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, talking about their clothing. So even the clothing that the Judaizers were wearing probably impressed the Corinthians. These traditional trappings, combined with their claim that they followed Christ, influenced some to abandon their loyalty to Paul. So he begins his defense by stating the obvious, that he and Timothy belong to Christ. But then he moves on to the authority given to him by Christ in verse 8. So in verse 8, which we just read, for even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave me for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be ashamed. So Paul had the authority of Christ himself. And because he did, this gave him confidence to deal with the opposers at Corinth. But the reason that Paul was given this authority was to build them up, So, brothers and sisters, we have to recognize that in the church, there is such a thing as spiritual authority. But this authority is for building people up. If you don't recognize this authority, or if you reject this authority, you're only going to harm yourself. Because if you either don't recognize or reject the authority that God has placed over you spiritually, then that means you're going to probably not take certain advice that those in spiritual authority give you. And that means you're probably going to fall into sin. I'll never forget, I've mentioned this person one other time at least, but a long time ago, when I was in my 20s, I used to live in California, and I trained with Ed Zajac, who actually won Mr. California. I think he won it the same year we were training together. And Ed was a Christian, and at least claimed to be a Christian. And so we also would have fellowship together a little bit. Well, then I started working for a federal agency, you know who, and I got transferred to Hawaii. So I went to Hawaii and lost touch with Ed. But like 2 years later, I walk into a gym in Hawaii, in Honolulu, and there's Ed, and he's working at the gym. So we started talking, and make a long story short, I would talk to him all the time at the gym, and I saw him frequently. And then it turns out he lost where he was renting someplace, and he got kicked out. I don't know if he didn't pay his rent, or I don't know what happened, but he said, I don't have any place to stay. At that time I was renting I owned this house. I owned a 3-bedroom house on Oahu, and I had it all to myself. So I said, hey, you can just come stay with me for a few days, even a few weeks, whatever, until you get back on your feet. So he packed up his bag. He literally only had one bag. So he comes to my house, and I told him I've got some things I have to do. I'll be gone most of the day. And so I had this big easy chair. He sat in it, and I said, I'll just see you when I get back. And I came back several hours later, and he goes, man, Craig, I just had this dream. It was this really terrifying dream. And in this dream, I dreamt that you and I were in the jungle, and we had rifles, and we were in some kind of a war. And then it was dark and foggy, and we were walking, and I turned around, and you were gone. And I started calling your name, Craig, Craig. And I couldn't find you. And then not long after that, I got surrounded by all these enemy soldiers, and they took me captive. And then I woke up, and I was scared. Now, obviously, winning Mr. California, he was way better built than I was. But spiritually speaking, he was really a child. I mean, he wasn't very far along in the faith. And so I told him, I said, well, Ed, I think it's obvious God's speaking to you to be really careful right now in your life. You've got to stay close to those that are spiritually more mature than you. I didn't say it was me, but I just, the dream, it was obvious. That's what God was telling him. And then I had to leave again. I came back, and he goes, hey, I am going to move in with some other friends of mine. And I said, why? And he goes, well, and he started telling me about it. It turns out they smoked pot. They weren't Christians. And I said, I don't think that's a wise choice for you, Ed. Anyway, he went ahead and moved in with them anyway. There's no doubt in my mind that God gave him that dream to prevent him from moving in with those guys. I saw him like a year or two later. I, with some other Christians, had gone to a concert. We were going to pass out tracts and hold up a banner, and it was some band that was not good. I can't remember who they were anymore. And Ed was there in line going in. And I said, hey, Ed. Anyway, I started talking to him. Turns out he wasn't going to church. And I said, you really need to be with God's people. And he says, well, I sort of am, because me and these guys I live with, we've been reading the Jesus Seminar books. Now, I don't know if you know who they are, but they are complete apostates and unbelievers. Anyway, after that, I never saw him again. And interestingly, I found him on Facebook about a year ago or so. And because he was sort of well known at one time, I mean, he was on covers of bodybuilding magazines. Because he was sort of well known, he doesn't accept friends. He has all these followers. And I'm looking at his Facebook page, and I still look at it now and then, and I don't see anything in there about faith. Now, he's a big supporter of President Trump, so he's not all bad. But he's a big supporter, but I don't see, I'm not sure what happened to him spiritually speaking. So God has given authority to certain people, spiritual authority, and what Paul is saying is you need to go ahead and be loyal to me. And you need to know that this erosion of our faith doesn't usually happen overnight. It's usually a slow process. So we need to be wary. We need to be careful. Then we get to verses 9 through 11. Let me read those again. I do not want to appear to be frightening you with my letters, for they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account. Let such a person understand that what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. So whenever the subject, this is what Paul's talking about now, his authority, right? Whenever the subject of authority comes up, some people get scared, they get frightened by it. Why? Because we don't like to be under authority. I've been a Christian for over 40 years. I still sometimes don't like to be under authority. We know that authority restricts us, and we want to be free to do as we please. But God's authority, of course, is for our good, and the restrictions that God places upon us are to keep us in a safe place. So we looked at verse 10 last week. We don't want to cover that. All Paul is saying here is that he's going to be bold if he has to come and visit them again. He will be bold. He won't be like they think he is. Then we get to verse 12. Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. So the Judaizers were comparing themselves to other people. They were telling the Corinthians something to the effect of, look how God has blessed us compared to how he has blessed Paul, or compared to how he has blessed these other people who came from Jerusalem too. In other words, they're comparing what God has done in their life, at least what they claim that God has done in their life, with what God has done in other people's lives. We have more. God has done more with us. That shows that God is with us. And you know what? We hear similar things from the prosperity gospel proponents on television today. So in our Sunday night study, we're on a book now, but a few weeks back, we watched a documentary called American Gospel, Christ Alone. And if you haven't seen that, the first half hour or so is free on YouTube. You can watch it. I highly recommend it. But in that video, a documentary, they played a clip of one of these prosperity teachers boasting, and I mean really boasting, of how much money he had. He went on and on about all the money that he had and the possessions that he had. And his implication was, because God has given me so much, that means God is with me. Pay attention to what I'm saying. Same thing the Judaizers were doing. But Paul did not compare himself with other people. Don't compare yourself with other people. It's a losing proposition. You'll either think too much of yourself when you compare yourself with someone less than you, or you're going to be miserable when you compare yourself with someone who's better off than you are. Just keep looking to Christ. Christ accepts you just the way you are, and he's gently transforming you. Don't compare yourself with others. Then we get to verse 13. But we will not boast beyond limits, but will boast only with regard to the area of influence God has assigned to us to reach even to you. So Paul refers to limits. Limits in boasting, and limits of influence. The Lord limits us. The New English Translation does really good with this verse. I like to look at it there too. There, it's up there. Okay, I like the way they do it. But we will not boast beyond certain limits, but will confine our boasting according to the limits of the work to which God has appointed us, that reaches even as far as you. So what the ESV calls limits of influence, the NET calls limits of work. The Lord appoints certain work to each one of us. Each one of us has a work to do for the Lord. And it has to do with your gift, of course. And the Lord grants influence to us in this work. For Paul, this work included the Corinthian church. Get to verse 14. For we are not overextending ourselves as though we did not reach you, for we were the first to come all the way to you with the gospel of Christ. Paul and Timothy had brought the gospel to Corinth. This was their work on behalf of the Lord. And their work now to continue to work with the Corinthians was an extension of their gospel preaching. In other words, when we share the gospel with somebody, we need to follow up. They are within our limits. They are part of the work that God has given us to do. One of the problems with the modern church is that, first of all, they don't preach the gospel enough, but when they do, and someone receives the Lord, they just let them go. We need to continue to labor for their grounding in the faith and their discipleship. Then we get to verse 15. We do not boast beyond limit in the labors of others, but our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence among you may be greatly enlarged. When Paul writes, we do not boast beyond limit in the labor of others, he's really subtly referring to the Judaizers. Even though Paul brought the gospel to them, the opposers then came in and tried to steal the work that Paul had accomplished. They criticized Paul and boasted in themselves. Paul desired that the limits of God for him would even include the areas around Corinth so the gospel could go forth. So we finally get to verse 18. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Paul is saying that the Lord has commended him. He is tactfully and subtly communicating that because the Lord has commended him, the Corinthians need to be loyal to Paul. If a person is living and working within the limits of God, as Paul was, then loyalty to that person is a virtue that is highly regarded in Scripture. In fact, a lack of loyalty in the Bible is seen as a weakness, a venality, something that is not a virtue, it's a vice. The Lord loves and honors loyalty. And I want us to consider very briefly, I'm going to go through these quickly, the domains of loyalty. I want to review them in order of importance from the least to the greatest. So first of all, the Bible speaks positively of loyalty to masters. In modern parlance, that would be loyalty to our bosses. Let's look at just one verse, Proverbs 27:18. Proverbs 27:18. The one who tends a fig tree will eat its fruit, and whoever takes care of his master will be honored. So in the same way that a person can enjoy fruits or vegetables from a garden that they tend, so too they will receive honor and promotion if they are loyal to their boss. Listen, every boss has virtues and they also have vices. Don't be that person who focuses on your boss's vices and who talks behind your boss's back. Besides being an expression of disloyalty, it just might be that what you say gets back to your boss. It's best to overlook the vices and focus on the positive qualities of your boss. I'll never forget when I was doing Phase 2 training in the Air Force, It's like the second phase of your training in your specialty field. I was a clinical lab tech. So phase 1 was 3 months of classwork, and then phase 2 was 9 months of on-the-job training, and you had really close supervision. And our trainers and our supervisors was a mixture of military. We had several sergeants, master sergeants, and then there were some civilians that were part of the program in fact, the main supervisor of the whole training program was a civilian lady. She was a skinny woman. She was very, very strict, and she did not have a good personality. She was abrupt. She was rude. Nobody liked her, but all the airmen gave her great deference because they realized that she had the authority to either pass you or fail you. You had to complete the program. If you didn't complete the program, if you didn't pass all the tests, if your work wasn't quality enough, you got kicked out of the program. In fact, 1 or 2 did. Well, one time when I was at lunch, I was sitting at a table with 2 other airmen. There was 3 of us. And one of them was expressing his opinion about this supervisor. And he expressed it in no uncertain terms, and they were not very complimentary. He talked about her scrawniness. He talked about her scratchy, screamy voice. He talked about her attitude. And while he was talking, she walked up behind him. And I'm trying with my eyes to, let him know that something's happening, but he didn't see it. And she stood there behind him while he was talking about her. And when he finally saw the expression on the other airman's face and my face, he realized something was wrong, and he turned around and he looked, and there she was. And I never in my life saw anyone turn such a deep shade of red in my life. He was embarrassed to no end. And fortunately, I remember he passed. But for the next several months, he had to go to work every day, talk to her, knowing that she knew everything that he had said about her. So I'm sure his remaining time in training wasn't very pleasant. So be loyal to your boss. Secondly, the Bible has a great deal to say about loyalty to the king. It portrays loyalty to the king as a reflection of loyalty to God. And this is even true when the king of Israel was not a good king. Think of David's loyalty to Saul when Saul was trying to kill him. He stayed loyal to Saul. In fact, throughout the Bible, a lack of loyalty to the king was something to be disdained. When an Amalekite, which was part of Israel's army, came across Saul, who was fatally wounded, and Saul actually asked him to kill him, the Amalekite obeyed and killed Saul. But when David heard about it, he had the Amalekite executed. Loyalty to the king was considered loyalty to God. So in modern times, the king represents our governing officials, from the president all the way down to a mayor. But the kind of loyalty that the king was supposed to receive in the Bible really is upheld as a virtue and can be applied to every sphere of loyalty. So let's keep that in mind. After Moses died, Joshua was given leadership of God's people, and they sought to take the good land, right? They were supposed to take the good land. So the loyalty of the children of Abraham is expressed to him, to Joshua, and is portrayed very favorably. Let's look at that. It's just a couple of verses. Joshua 1, 16 through 18. Joshua chapter 1, 16 through 18. So Joshua had just given them a bunch of commands. And then we read this. And they answered Joshua, "All that you have commanded us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses." And of course, if you've read Joshua, you know that the Lord was with Joshua. "Whoever rebels against your commandment and disobeys your words, whatever you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. So they're encouraging Joshua. They were loyal to Joshua. You know, one of the most interesting characters in the entire Bible is Joab, David's general throughout his tenure as king. Even when he was cast off the throne by Absalom, Joab was his general. And he was a strange man. He was a mixture of virtues and vices. Two vices that he had was, first of all, he loved violence, bad vice, and he sought vengeance when vengeance really belongs to the Lord. And these two vices met together when he murdered Abner. But he also had good qualities. He was a very brave man. When Jerusalem was still held by the wicked Jebusites before it became the city of David, in other words, it was still being held by the original dwellers of the land. It was a fortress. Job went in first. That's unusual, isn't it, for someone who is in charge to go in first. He went in first and fought them and ultimately defeated them. And he gave the city to David. He was responsible in a good way. After Jerusalem was conquered, he took charge of repairing the city from all the damage that it had experienced from the assault. His greatest quality, though, was that he was fiercely loyal to David. When you read of all the dangers that were posed against David, there was Joab defending him and supporting him time after time after time, even when David did wrong. Well, he should have been held accountable for the murder of Abner. He should have been put to death. Even though he was a general, that's not an excuse. But because he was so loyal to David, David spared him. Now, David knew that justice had to be administered. So when David was dying, he told his son Solomon to carry out the right sentence. Because David was not unjust. He was trying to balance the justice with the loyalty of Joab. So Solomon did execute Joab after David passed away. But by Joab being loyal to David, he spared his life for years and years and years. Loyalty has its rewards. Thirdly, loyalty to the king also signifies a greater loyalty, loyalty to one's nation. We call it patriotism. To be patriotic reflects an appreciation for what one's nation has done for you. You know, those who demand more all the time, who are unsatisfied with all the opportunities that have been given to us in this nation, it's not a virtue. And you know what? Have you seen some of the pictures of these people who have been arrested, who are doing the riots and always speaking against America? They've got tattoos on their faces. I mean, my opinion, tattoos are bad enough as they are. I mean, but if you have it on your back or your ankle, you know, most people don't see it. But if you have a tattoo on your face, what is that about? I mean, the rest of your life, people are going to be looking at your face and seeing a tattoo. They've got green hair. Oh, sorry, Dakota. They've got all kinds of, I mean, just look at their pictures. You could see their disdain for America reflected in the way they look. Loyalty to one's country is a good thing. Fourthly, we are called by God to be loyal to our spouse. It becomes difficult to remain loyal if one's spouse is not loyal to them. When one is not loved and cherished, those are the vows, right? Then temptation arises to not love in return. But this is not an option for a Christian. We are called to love even when we are not loved. Loyalty to our husband or wife is held by the Lord in the highest regard. We ought to be loyal to our church. It seems to be a trend in modern times that if there's anything that is in the least bit unsatisfactory in a local church, then members are prone to find another church. Oh, they don't like the music. Oh, they don't like the carpeting. Oh, they don't like this doctrine. Oh, they don't like the fact that there's not enough people or whatever. There seems to be no loyalty. And those who seem to be easily unsatisfied, then move on to another church. We had at least two couples that I remember that came to our church for a few months, and then they were gone. And then I spoke to the wives of both of those couples, because one wife used to work at County Market, and I ran into them. I just happened to run into them and spoke to them, and I heard the same story from both wives. And the story was this: this is not the first time this has happened. As a matter of fact, this has been going on for years. We go to a church for a few months, and then my husband finds something wrong, and we have to go somewhere else. And it seems to happen, they told me, right when I'm making friends with other women in the church. So it does seem to be a problem, at least experientially, with men more than with women. But we want to be loyal to our church. You will never find a church that agrees with you on every doctrine or every practice. Every church has problems, but be loyal to your church. Now, of course, there's exceptions. You can't deal with heresy. If there's heresy going on, you have to leave. So the Apostle Paul was seeking to stir up the loyalty of the Corinthians to his ministry, to himself. He had brought the gospel to them, and if someone brings you the gospel, there should be some measure of loyalty. I can think back, not that they shared the gospel with me, I was already a Christian, but the three men of God in my life that when I was a young Christian really poured their lives into me, I have so much respect and honor for them. So loyalty to one's spiritual mentors is a blessing to both the mentor and the one being mentored. And I'm going to close with this. The last and most important loyalty is to Christ himself. We have to be loyal to our King. When King David was cast off the throne by Absalom, he had to flee the kingdom. He was passing the last house on the edge of Jerusalem, and there he was saying goodbye to the many of his servants who would stay and serve the new king, Absalom. And do you remember the Philistines? They were enemies of God's people, right? Goliath, you will remember, was from the city of Gath, the Philistine capital. Well, as David was escaping Israel to go into the wilderness where he would live for a long time, there was a man who wanted to go with him. He was a Gittite, meaning he was from Gath. And his name was Ittai. I want to read this account. It's rather short. It's in 2 Samuel 15, verses 19 through 22. Then the king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king," meaning Absalom. "For you are a foreigner